Today we have Reverend Lindsay Roan with us. She is an ordained interfaith chaplain at Hospice of Southern Maine. She has her bachelor's in social work and her master's in divinity. Prior to hospice work, Lindsay worked in parish ministry and in the social work field. Lindsay ultimately found that her journey alongside those who were sick, dying, and grieving was a place she felt she was being led into. She was welcomed into Hospice of Southern Maine almost 5 years ago and is grateful for the gifts this work brings every day to her. We also have Betty Fortuin with us, and she is a medical social worker in the home hospice program with Hospice of Southern Maine. She has her master's in social work and is a licensed clinical social worker. Prior to working in the hospice setting, Betty has experience as a behavioral health clinician for Southern Maine Health Center, Family Practice and Oncology Services, the Opportunity Alliance, and Long Creek Youth Center. She also spent time as program director with Volunteers of America, working with the Maine Correctional Center Women's Reentry Program and Veterans Support Services, and recently as an adjunct professor with Southern Maine Community College. She has experience providing individual and group therapy, support, and resource assistance to her clients, patients, and family. Welcome, Betty. Thank you. And Caroline O'Malley Scott is a registered nurse and currently a transitional care nurse at Hospice of Southern Maine. Caroline graduated from Northwick Park School of Nursing in Middlesex, England. Prior to working for the hospice agency, Caroline has vast experience in intensive care and interventional radiology nursing. Caroline joined Hospice of Southern Maine 6 years ago and feels that this is her calling in life, caring for hospice patients and their families. This feeds her soul. Currently, Caroline meets with patients and their families in the hospital or in their homes to educate, plan, and support them into transitioning to hospice services. Welcome, ladies. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm going to open up the first point of discussion for the panel today, and we'll start with sort of some of the logistics that come along with planning for end-of-life care. So as you've worked with patients and families who are in the early stages of entering hospice care and coming on service with Hospice of Southern Maine, what are some of the critical planning and logistics pieces that you assist with, knowing there is often a lot going on in the background? So there's often some trauma, some shock, maybe some heightened emotion, some things going on in families. Are there ways and things that you do specifically at the beginning at this point to assist families to really get a plan to get them started? We'll start with you, Caroline.
So when I meet with patients and their families, it's usually in the hospital, sometimes at home, when they've been told that there are no more treatment options for them, or often also the families and patients don't want any more treatment because of the side effects of treatment, and they know that the treatment isn't being effective any longer. So there is a lot of raw emotions at this time, with disbelief, stress. People are scared. You know, their lives have been treatment every day for such a long time, and now they're just thrown out there and being told it's done, and we're recommending hospice. So when I meet with patients and their families, a very important part is for the patient to know that even though they don't feel it at that moment, but they are in charge of everything that happens from this moment on. They decide where they want to die, who they want to take care of them, and how they want that journey to look. Explaining that hospice is there not just to care for them with physical pain, but also any other issues with breathing or anxiety, nausea, whatever the symptom is. And emotional support as well as spiritual and psychological, which my colleagues will go into here shortly. Some things that we talk about at this time with regards to planning is there's a lot of questions with regards to medications. What medications will patients stop, and what medications can they continue on? And we go in detail explaining that with patients and their families and answering any questions they have at that time. And we also look at what equipment a patient may need in their home in order to have a comfortable end of life. So whether it's organizing hospital beds, wheelchairs, that type of thing.
Great, thank you. Betty, do you have something to add, Lindsay or Lindsay?
I think because there's so much emotion, what I try to do on spiritual other things is really just create a container and hold space for all of those emotions and just allow whatever needs to pour out for them to pour out into that space and not come with any agenda at all, and just sit and be and let whatever comes from whoever they invite into that space, into that room, to pour out and flow and create a plan from whatever is there. And that's really how I initiate my visit when I first encounter somebody at the very beginning.
Thank you.
And I think that's really key what you said, Lindsay, is that we are creating a non-judgmental space for families, and we're trying to normalize an abnormal situation, which is absolutely the most difficult thing, I think, for any family to try and wrap their heads around, is that now, and if you listen to the lingo and all the paperwork, it's a Medicare definition, 6 months or less is part of the qualifications that you have left to become eligible for hospice, as well as symptoms. When you hear I have 6 months or less left to live, it's pretty overwhelming. And I think that's what, as a team, we work so well at doing, is trying to, again, normalize the situation. As Caroline said, often it's unexpected. They didn't see this coming. And how are we walking in the room and saying, okay, we're going to take care of it? So trying to really meet people, like Lindsay said, where they're at, and trying to support them with information they've never, ever often thought about. And how do we do that? For the social worker, often it's just looking at financial things. Have you got your advanced directive done, or your will? And sometimes looking for financial assistance. Maybe this person that's now dying was the sole breadwinner, and now what are they going to do with their setting? So it's a multiple layer of situations that we're trying to walk into a room and assess, and we don't do it in one day. And that's the other thing, is to really give the family space to process all of us coming in, especially the nurse. The nurse is giving them this information. It's like, we don't want that medication. We never thought we'd have to use that. And it's all new. And that's what we have a really good understanding of. All of this is new for families. And we're trying to, again, make it normal for them. There are some resources. I'm not sure if you want me to get those now for Hospice Health Foundation is one which will help with some financial assistance, and they're out of Portsmouth. So if anyone's interested in that link, certainly post that for you folks. I think as far as, I think there was a question about advanced Directives of Maine. It's the same one as far as I know. There isn't any changes that I'm aware of. And the beauty of that is quite often now, primary care docs take care of that document, and they have a copy of that. So we're able to do it that way. Or if needed, we can sit with the family and do that, or offer them a blank copy. Doesn't have to be notarized. I think that's one thing that people get really uptight about, is a lot of this stuff has to be notarized, but it doesn't. The advanced directive does not. So again, more things that we can post if that's more information you want regarding those documents.
That's really helpful information. Thank you. And feel free to enter a question in the chat if you're listening and something comes to mind as our guest is speaking, and we'll try to get to your questions today. Betty, you mentioned that you like to frame discussions around end-of-life care planning as a conversation about the patient's final wishes. And as a patient settles into that understanding of their circumstances and diagnosis, how does a discussion of final wishes naturally lend itself to the planning process? So what are some of the important aspects in the planning process that help patients gain peace, control, or comfort as you sort of try to frame it up around final wishes? I really like that idea.
Yeah. Do you want me to go ahead and start?
Sure.
Sure. For me, final wishes can mean a multitude of things. And for some families, it immediately, when you talk about final wishes, they go, oh, final arrangements for funeral home, or is it a body donation, or is it cremation? So it's a multitude of items. And for nursing, it means different things. And for Lindsay's chaplain, it means something else. So I love the term of saying to someone, have you explored your final wishes with your family? Because again, this is often so new and so right in their face immediately happening that it's a term that they can, okay, what do you mean by final wishes? That we can explore more with families, what their thoughts are. Or if they have not gone to that place at all, what are they going to focus on? And I, again, quite often are the funeral arrangements. Just let's talk about, cremation, or what you want, or is it the body donation? Helping them gather those things together. Or is it to have a celebration before I die, not after I die? Let's have a celebration of life at the home. So those type of things are what I kind of focus on, is how can we help them wrap their head around what the patient really wants, not just what the family wants. Focus on what are their wishes prior to end of life. And I think that maybe kind of swings into Lindsay, what you may explore with final wishes with families, talking about final wishes and things like that.
Yeah, I think it does segue very well. For some people, there is a connection very much with ritual and with churches specifically, or temples, and other spiritual faith communities that they have. And they might have a connection already. And part of what I do as a chaplain is connect them with those communities of faith that they're already part of, or with a community of faith that's part of their tradition that they may no longer be connected with, finding somebody in the local community that they can feel comfortable with, so that they can start those arrangements or arrange those rituals that are part of their culture or heritage, so that those things can be officiated at time of death, and that we can make sure those wishes are honored by the team. And sometimes the rituals are things that they create because they feel important to them and their family, and they're created out of what would bring them peace. And sometimes those rituals are of a spiritual nature, but not a religious nature. So it's about finding songs that bring them peace that they might play, or creating a gathering in a way that celebrates them, gathering people around and playing a song while the person is dying, lighting candles, aren't necessarily traditional in a religious body, but are very much a ritual, and it's a way of remembering. And so a lot of that is an act of remembrance and honoring, and those are very much woven into how we say goodbye and honoring of a person. And that's part of what we do to help us really dig in and say goodbye. And that's part of the chaplain process. Yes.
And I often will visit with a patient and their loved ones when it's close to the end. And it's very alien often. And they're sitting in silence. And I always encourage families, if they're comfortable, to play their loved one's favorite songs, reminisce on their vacations they've had, or Christmases in the past. They celebrate Christmas. To fill the room with love and warmth and have this a memory of their last days with their parent or loved one. And also to remind people that hearing is the last sense to go. So even if the patient can no longer speak to us, if they're unconscious, they can still hear us. So if there are still conversations that you want to have with your loved one, it's not too late. Just because they can't reply, it doesn't mean that we can't have these conversations.
Yeah, that's a great point. Caroline, you may be able to answer this question that's come in through the chat. Somebody would just like an understanding of the difference between palliative care and hospice care and how patients transition maybe from one to the other, and how, if that is part of the planning process from your perspective.
So people are often having palliative care treatment, which would mean that they're continuing to have their symptoms managed with chemotherapy. For example, if it's cancer, not to make the disease better, but to just control the symptoms so they don't get worse. When someone comes on hospice, it's because we know that they don't want to have any more treatments. They just want to be kept comfortable. They don't want to be going in and out of appointments. They don't want the side effects of the treatments. And that's when, we get involved in keeping them comfortable at that point, and keeping them at home, or filling their days with going to the beach to smell the ocean for the last time, or whatever it is, rather than going in and out of doctors' offices.
I often think that that's a really key point, is when somebody comes on hospice services and you say you don't have to go to the hospital anymore, or you don't have to go to the doctor's office anymore. Finally, that's such a relief to so many families. Not, it's a shock that they're hospice, but also when they reach that point, they realize, oh, this is really where I'm at. This is where I need to be at. This is where I can have a good quality of life through the end of life.
Betty, a question came in about, do you find that there's financial assistance available for everyday care for people who don't have access to a full support system at home?
Normally not, unless they have main care. Often if individuals are at the point where they do qualify for main care, we can find more help that way. And we do provide a private caregiver list resources out there for people who do have some financial needs to assist themselves.
And there's a question specifically, I think it's aimed at direct medical supplies or equipment. Do you find that there are things that patients need that aren't covered while they're on hospice, or most of the time is the equipment needed covered?
Caroline can speak to that, but from my perspective, that's another godsend of hospice. We cover it all.
Yeah.
Caroline can name off the DME. I think it's pretty broad.
So there's very few things, if anything, that a patient would require when they're going through this process that we wouldn't supply. So for example, things that we do provide is hospital beds, wheelchairs, bedside commodes, walkers, shower chairs, Hoyer lifts. And if there's something that you think you may need, ask us, because it may not be the normal thing, but it could very well be something that we would still provide that might not be well known.
Thank you. Let's move on to another point of discussion, which would be talking about life story and life experience for care.
So how can
an individual effectively plan around what they would like to be their legacy or life story? What are the pieces of the puzzle that you often help them put together and support as a team member, as they're taking time to do the planning that is meaningful to them around their story? And if you have a memorable story to share with us that you're able to, this would be a great time as well. I think the audience would appreciate that. Caroline, do you want to start?
Yes. I think a very important part for a lot of people when they're at their end of life and they're reflecting back on the life that they've lived, they'll often want to mend fractured relationships. It could have been 30 years prior with perhaps their son that they haven't been in contact with. And this comes up quite frequently in hospice when they want to get in contact with that person. And we help to promote that and navigate that for the patient and the family. Sometimes they will meet in person, sometimes it can be virtually. But the important thing is that they get that peace of mind, and the family member or friend gets that peace of mind that this is unfinished business that now has been taken care of. I have many great stories from my time in hospice. A lot to choose from, but one story I particularly like is a few years ago I met a homeless lady in hospital, and she was very anxious because she was used to being out on the streets and living very independently, and now here she was in a hospital room with people coming in, talking to her and asking her questions and being in her space. So I met with her several times to talk about where her health was, that she was reaching the end of her life, what were her wishes. She had this big mat of hair at the back. And each day I would go there and ask her, would she like me to comb her hair? And this way we could communicate without her having to make eye contact. So I'd sit behind her and we would chat, and I didn't care about her matting her head. She didn't care either. It was just a way of us to bond. And it came to being Christmas Eve, and she was very worried about where she would go after the hospital. And it was time for her to go to Gosnell House. She was very close to dying. And when she went to Gosnell House and she came through the doors, she looked around and her eyes lit up and she said, "What did I do to deserve to come to such a beautiful place?" And I teared up and I thought, she's lived such a hard, tough life, and everyone deserves to die well. And I knew in my heart and soul that she was going to die well. And it was Christmas Eve, and she died early hours of Christmas morning. And
I can see the place decorated.
yes,
That's what costs all that.
Yeah.
Braces on individual, especially for time of the family.
yeah. And
Great story.
I knew, however she lived, she was dying well, and she deserved that.
Lindsay?
I need to recover from Caroline's story. I would say that legacy and life story is really the area that is the chaplain's favorite area, and the area that I really zone in and focus in on. A lot of what I focus on are the some days that I talk to patients about. What are the things that you always said, I'll get to that someday. Someday I want to reach out to that person. Someday I plan to forgive them. Someday I plan to ask forgiveness from them for this. Someday I'm gonna tell that person that I love them, or ask if they can forgive me and love me too. All those words we hope to hear someday, or have conversations about someday, or mend relationships about someday. Now's someday. And so I really dig in at this time and talk to them about all of those somedays, and how can we kind of dig into that work and find ways to do that healing at this time. And some of that is through letter writing. Some of those letters get sent. Some of those letters just get written. Sometimes people aren't strong enough to write, and so they dictate and I write. Sometimes we crumple them up. Sometimes we burn them. Sometimes we bury them. Sometimes we just speak the words into the air, and we tell the stories, and we know that at least we're not holding it in ourselves, that someone else has heard our story and that it's gotten out, and that we're not carrying that story alone anymore. We don't have to be alone in that knowledge or that pain, and it can be free from us. And so that's a lot of the work that I do, is making sure you're not alone in this.
Lindsay, someone's asking how much time you're able to spend with a patient when you're doing this work?
Over the course of time or in each session?
Maybe a little bit of both.
Okay. Over the course of time, it really depends on something bigger than me, and how soon they get on services. For some people, it can be a while. Hospice is supposed to be for people who have a life expectancy of 6 months or less, but we all know that that is an estimate. So some people do have longer than that, and some people have a lot less time than that. So there are patients that I only get to have a couple visits with, and then there are patients that I meet with for a year. But I usually try to have visits that are at least an hour. If a patient is able to physically meet for an hour. And there are other patients that ask if we can have a longer session because they really want to dig into something deep, and that's also okay. And there are patients who ask to meet with me more frequently but have shorter visits because they get really weary. So we have shorter visits, but we see each other more frequently. So I really am able to tailor things to the needs of the patient.
So that's great.
Yeah.
And do you have a story you want to share?
I do. One of the things I love to do is letter writing with people, because I do think that that is a great way to get out some of what's inside. So one of my patients came to me and said they found their son. They came to me urgently when I walked through the door and said, I need to speak with you. Pulled me into the side room and they said, I found my son. He was in his room and he was reading a book on grief. I'm very concerned that he is thinking a lot about me dying and has been scared to kind of unpack this with me. I'm not sure I've done a good enough job saying goodbye. I need to know that I've said everything right. How can I make sure that I've said everything well? And so we talked about this. And in the process of the conversation, she said, can you tell me, have you talked to people after somebody has died? And I said, yeah, I've talked to family members after their loved ones died. She said, what's one thing you often hear? I said, well, I often hear that they wish that they could hear that their loved one loved them one more time. And she said, I want to do that. I want to do that for my son. I said, okay. So she wrote this beautiful letter, and it's all written out. She folded it all up, she put it all together, and she gave it to me. And I'm the only person that knows this letter exists. And when he dies, or sorry, when she dies, I am going to deliver this letter to him. And it is one more I love you from her to him. And I am the only one that knows. And that is her gift, her legacy that she has left.
That's lovely. Thank you. And Betty, some final thoughts on this topic as well. And the question was also addressed to you about time. Do you have the same ability to spend time with a patient family that Lindsay does?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Weekly, bi-weekly, whatever.
Okay.
And I think when I speak of legacy with families, I really want to go to the patient and ask them if they can answer, what do you think their legacy is or that for them? Or is there someone that you would like to see that you haven't seen or spoken to before you leave that you really want to say goodbye to? And quite often, not unusual to get on the phone and call somebody in another country, across the coast to say goodbye to them, to FaceTime. Thank God for technology these days. Allows us to communicate, or them to communicate with others.
Can you speak up a little bit, Betty? They're having trouble hearing you.
Sure, yeah. Always. So technology, using technology to communicate with loved ones or individuals that someone needs to say goodbye to, definitely use it. And I want to not give you guys, I have a story, but I also want to express what this work means in the regard of how humbling it is to be a part of all of my patients' lives. It's truly profound. And I think what makes that so profound for me are my colleagues. We cannot do this work individually. We need to have teams. We need to have the wonderful colleagues that we have at HSM to really support what all of us are trying to do, and is to give someone a peaceful end of life process. And so for me, most profound is a few months ago, we lost one of our own social work colleagues. She died about, I think it's 6 months or 5 months. And it was probably the most graceful and profound end of life that I've been involved in. And it was so difficult to watch this, but she is the one who made it profound and made it meaningful to all of us to die embraced with family and colleagues and strangers. It didn't matter who you were. This is a woman who embraced us all for a very long period of time. And I just want to say that that's why we do this work, is because of individuals and families who need us. So thank you.
Thank you.
And if I may just say one last thing. That thing for me about hospice is when people wait too long to start services. We say that it's never too early, but it's often too late. When people come on services early, they get to know us, we get to know them. We're not strangers in their home. And also, we help them to live as well as they can, for as long as they can, making sure that we are keeping them comfortable. Like I said, whether it's with pain or anxiety or breathing, we're helping them with their relationships, we're supporting their family members through this process. This is one of the hardest things people will do. And rather than doing it alone and fumbling, to have the support of us, to be able to help them. You know, as opposed to going in 2 days beforehand when everyone's in crisis and panic, and the patients in pain. And, to me, that's a really sad thing when we, you know, weren't called 4 months ago or whenever. People try to avoid talking about death and dying and not planning for it and thinking it's not going to happen to me. And if I plan for it, am I bringing it upon myself earlier than I should? No, just be prepared, and we're here for you.
That's great. Thanks, Caroline. And to remember that anyone can make a referral to hospice so that you can come on services earlier, hopefully, and get everything out of it that's possible. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I especially want to thank our 3 lovely panelists for this discussion. I know we went a little over. I appreciate you sticking around for those of you who were able to. If you would like to share this webinar with family or friends, you can check our website for Ask the Experts. It's askhospiceexperts.org. And we have another event coming up. We hope you can join us in the end of May. We're going to have a webinar on creating community, the benefits of becoming a hospice volunteer. So we look forward to you joining us for that event in the end of May. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.